The knock came just as I was wiping down the kitchen counter. It was a little after 7 in the evening. The dishwasher was humming. There was a pot of rice cooling on the stove, and the smell of ginger still hung in the air from dinner. My son was in the front room with a book open on his lap and his chair angled toward the window the way he liked it when the streetlights came on. When I opened the door, 2 police officers were standing on the porch. The older one looked past me and said, very plainly, "Ma'am, we're here to arrest your son in connection with a robbery." I kept one hand on the doorknob. "For what amount?" I asked. He checked the paper in his hand. A theft totaling $100,000. I remember that number because it sounded so clean and official, too polished to belong anywhere near my house. I stepped aside and let them in. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. By then, I had already lived through enough surprises to know that panic rarely improves anything. I just remember the cool brass of the door handle against my palm and the soft sound of my son turning a page in the other room. Then the officers saw him. Both of them stopped. My son was sitting where I had left him in his wheelchair, wearing gray sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt his cousin had given him. A blanket was folded neatly over his legs. His glasses had slipped a little down his nose. He looked up from his book with the patient expression of someone used to adults entering rooms with the wrong assumptions. The younger officer glanced at the paper, then back at my son. I looked at them and said, "My son is right there." Neither officer spoke for a moment. That was not the beginning of the story, of course. By then, the damage had already been done. The papers, the lies, the missing money, the false concern, the years of being told to be reasonable by people who had never once had to carry what I carried. But that was the moment I understood that my former husband had done something so reckless, so ugly, that it had finally reached my front door. A week later, I would sit across from a federal investigator with a banker's box full of records and hear a sentence that explained everything. But that night, I was still standing in my own hallway in stocking feet, watching 2 officers realize they had been sent to arrest the wrong kind of boy. My name is Helen Chin. I am 46 years old, and for most of my adult life I believed that if I stayed calm long enough, the truth would eventually sort itself out. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it takes years. I was married to Daniel Mercer for 15 years. We lived outside Aurora, in a quiet subdivision with narrow maples in the front yards and the kind of sidewalks where people still waved if they recognized your dog. Daniel worked in private wealth management downtown. He liked tailored suits, expensive watches, and the sound of his own certainty. I worked at a rehabilitation hospital. My hours were long, but they were honest, and at the end of the day I could usually point to something concrete I had done for another human being. Our son, Ethan, was born with cerebral palsy. He is 18 now. He uses a wheelchair, thinks faster than most adults I know, and has a way of looking at people that makes dishonesty feel clumsy. When he was younger, I used to think Daniel would grow into fatherhood slowly. Some people do. Some people need time to understand that love is not admiration. It is repetition. It is lifts and ramps and late appointments and insurance calls and showing up when the work is boring. Daniel never learned that. He liked the appearance of being a father more than the practice of it. By the end of our marriage, I knew it in small ways first. He was irritated by schedules. He sighed during therapy appointments. He asked questions about cost with more energy than he asked questions about progress. Then came the affair, which in some ways felt less surprising than it should have. I found out because of a receipt left in the pocket of one of his jackets. Hotel, dinner, flowers, all itemized like any other transaction. When I put it on the kitchen table, he looked at it, looked at me, and sat down as though I had interrupted something routine. He did not deny it. He said he was tired of living in what he called a permanent crisis. He said our home revolved around equipment, medication reminders, specialists, and limitations. Then he said something I still remember word for word, because some sentences do not fade. "I'm done organizing my life around a child who will always need something." I did not answer right away. The refrigerator motor kicked on behind me. Outside, a sprinkler clicked across the front lawn. My tea had gone cold beside the sink. I said, "You mean your son?" He rubbed at his cuff, like the conversation was inconveniencing him. The divorce took almost a year. Daniel fought support, challenged medical expenses, and acted as though the basic cost of raising a disabled child had been invented to punish him personally. The court did not agree. I got primary custody. He was ordered to pay monthly support and half of Ethan's uncovered medical costs. He left the courthouse that day without looking at us. For a while, he paid just enough to look compliant. Then the delays started. Then the excuses. Then the checks that cleared late or not at all. And somewhere in the middle of all that, with bills stacked in one drawer and therapy schedules taped inside another cabinet, I began to notice that Daniel had started asking unusual questions. Not about Ethan's pain level, not about school, not about whether he was sleeping better, about records, about invoices, about specialists, about what insurance had denied and what it had approved. At first, I thought it was guilt arriving late. I know better now. That evening, after the officers lowered their papers and asked if they could sit down, I looked toward the sideboard by the dining room wall. There was a manila folder inside the top drawer. I had started keeping copies of everything in it 3 months earlier. Then I waited. One of the officers asked if they could explain why they had come. I said yes, and we moved into the living room. The lamp beside Ethan's chair was on. It cast a warm circle over the rug and the edge of the coffee table. My tea towel was still tucked into the waistband of my skirt. I remember taking it out and folding it once before I sat down. Small things help when a room has shifted and everyone in it knows it. The older officer introduced himself as Sergeant Miller. The younger one said his name was Ortiz. They looked embarrassed, which I appreciated more than I expected. Sergeant Miller glanced at Ethan, then back at me. "We received information from an ongoing fraud complaint," he said. "Your son's name was listed in documents tied to a financial theft. There were also statements suggesting he had access to certain transferred funds." Ethan closed his book carefully and rested it on his lap. "That would be impressive," he said evenly, "considering I don't even have my own debit card." Ortiz gave the smallest, involuntary huff of laughter, then straightened again. I asked where the documents had come from. Sergeant Miller said they had originated in a private complaint that had recently been referred to financial crimes. He did not give me every detail. He did not need to. By then, I already knew one thing with perfect clarity. Daniel had used our son's name for something. I asked if the complaint named a reporting party. Sergeant Miller hesitated. A man named Daniel Mercer came up more than once. I did not react outwardly. I just nodded once. Ethan looked at me, and I could see the same understanding settle over him. Not surprise. Not exactly. More like recognition. The kind that comes when bad behavior finally reaches a shape you can point at. I stood, crossed to the sideboard, and opened the top drawer. Inside was the manila folder. It had started as a place for late payment notices and medical invoices. Then it became a place for text screenshots, returned check copies, visitation cancellations, insurance correspondence, and notes from my attorney. By then it had thickened into something heavier than paper. A record. A pattern. A timeline. I brought it back to the coffee table and opened it. "For the last 3 years," I said, "my former husband has been under court order to support our son. He has repeatedly failed to do that. He has also asked for medical records he had no practical reason to need, requested cost breakdowns he never contributed to, and made false claims about Ethan's condition to people outside the family." The room stayed quiet. I handed Sergeant Miller a copy of the custody order first, then a support ledger, then a packet of communication logs my attorney had told me to print and keep in chronological order. Dates, missed payments, excuses, demands for paperwork, sudden concern whenever money was involved. Ortiz read more quickly than Miller. I could see his expression change as the pages turned. Ethan sat very still. That was one of the hardest parts of raising a child through someone else's selfishness. They learn to sit still in rooms where they should never have had to be present. Sergeant Miller looked up after a minute. "You said false claims about his condition." "Yes," I said. "About a year ago, I learned Daniel had been telling people Ethan was either terminally ill or already dead, depending on who he was talking to." Ortiz looked up sharply. "Dead?" "Yes." The word landed heavily in the room. I said it the same way I might have said late or misfiled. Calmly. There are moments when calm is the only dignified thing left. A woman I knew from years ago had approached me outside a pharmacy with tears in her eyes. She had touched my arm and said she was sorry for my loss. For a second, I thought she had mistaken me for someone else. Then she mentioned Daniel's name. She said his girlfriend had posted something vague and tragic online. A hard season. A father carrying impossible grief. Requests for privacy. Ethan had been home that afternoon, arguing with me about whether frozen dumplings counted as a proper lunch. That was how I found out my former husband had decided it was easier to erase his son than explain his absence. I had documented that too. I handed Sergeant Miller printed screenshots and a short statement from the woman who had seen the post. Then one from another acquaintance who said Daniel had told him privately that his son had not made it past 16. A neat phrase. Controlled. Almost elegant. Daniel had always liked language that made cruelty sound unfortunate instead of chosen. Miller read longer this time. Ethan spoke without looking at either officer. He likes stories where he comes out looking tragic. It works better for him. No one answered right away. There was a clock over the mantel, and I could hear it ticking. Outside, a car passed slowly through the neighborhood. The dishwasher had finished and gone quiet. Ordinary sounds. That helped. Miller finally set the papers down. "Mrs. Chin," he said, "I think we may have approached this from the wrong direction." "I think so too," I said. He nodded. "This complaint suggests your son may have been named in financial representations made to third parties. Based on what I'm seeing here, it may be that his identity or medical circumstances were used without his knowledge." "Without his knowledge," I said, "and without his consent." Ethan gave a small, dry smile. "I'm pretty sure identity fraud is still identity fraud when the victim uses a wheelchair." Ortiz looked almost angry then, though not at us. I asked what had triggered the visit tonight. Miller consulted his notebook. A retirement-age complainant had come forward after losing a large amount of money in what she believed was a short-term investment opportunity. She had been shown records referencing a young man with severe medical needs. Ethan's name appeared in the file. There were statements about treatment costs, specialized equipment, and urgent family obligations. The amount attached to the current complaint was just over $100,000. The number from the porch settled into place. Not random. Not mistaken. Built. I turned to Ethan. He was looking at the folder, not at me. "Did you ever sign anything your father sent you?" I asked. "No. Did you ever give him banking information?" "No. Photos? Medical updates? School records?" He thought for a second. "A picture from graduation planning. And maybe that old physical therapy certificate from sophomore year. He texted once and said he wanted to show somebody I was working hard." I closed my eyes for the span of one breath. That was Daniel's method. He rarely took anything outright when charm could make people hand it over. I reached for another section of the folder. There were printed texts from Daniel. Harmless on the surface. Asking after Ethan's classes. Asking whether the new chair had come in. Asking if his neurologist had changed anything. Asking for copies for insurance. Asking for details in case anyone asks how you're doing. At the time, I had flagged them because they felt wrong. Not warm. Not fatherly. Precise. That was when my attorney, Laura Bennett, had said something I wrote down that same day. When someone withholds money but seeks documentation, assume the documentation has value to them. I had underlined it twice. Sergeant Miller read through those texts, then asked if there was anyone already representing me on the child support matter. "Yes," I said. "Laura Bennett. Family law. Would she know about any larger financial concerns?" "She knows I suspected hidden income. She doesn't yet know what you've just told me." Miller nodded slowly. "Call her first thing in the morning." I said, "I'll call her tonight." He did not argue. Before they left, both officers apologized directly to Ethan. Not in the vague way institutions sometimes do. Clearly. By name. Ethan accepted it with more grace than most adults could have managed. After the door closed behind them, he stayed in the living room for a while with his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. I went back to the kitchen and turned the rice over with a spoon, though neither of us was hungry anymore. Then I heard his wheels behind me. "Mom," he said. I turned. "If he used my name," he said, "I want to know everything." I set the spoon down. The overhead light made the counter look almost silver. On the far end of it sat my phone, face down beside the folded mail. I picked it up, opened my contacts, and called Laura Bennett. She answered on the third ring. I said, "Laura, the police were just here because Daniel has been using Ethan's name in a fraud case." There was a brief silence on the line. Then her voice changed. And that was when things began to move. Laura did not waste time with comfort. She asked 3 questions in a row. Were the officers local or federal? Did they leave any paperwork? Had they said exactly how Ethan's name had been used? I answered as clearly as I could while standing at the kitchen counter with one hand still resting on the edge of the sink. She told me not to send anything to anyone yet. Not by email. Not by text. Not until she had looked at it first. Then she asked me to photograph the officer's card, the notes I had written down, and the front of the folder with the date. Her voice was clipped in the way it became when she saw a clean route through a mess. "I want copies of every request Daniel ever made for medical records," she said. "Every text, every email, every form, every delayed payment around the same periods. Don't sort by emotion. Sort by date." That line stayed with me. Don't sort by emotion. Sort by date. I pulled a notepad toward me and wrote it down. Laura said she would clear her morning calendar. She wanted me in her office by 9:30 with a full file. She also wanted Ethan there if he felt up to it, because if his name or condition had been used in financial solicitations, his account of what he did and did not authorize mattered. When I hung up, Ethan was still at the table. He had moved from the living room on his own while I was on the call and was now sitting under the pendant light with his hands folded loosely in front of him. The rice had gone cold. The kitchen smelled faintly of dish soap and ginger. Outside, someone on the block started a car and then shut it off again. "Laura says we go in tomorrow morning," I said. He nodded once. Then he said, "So he didn't just lie about me. He used me." "Yes," I said. I did not soften it. There are times when softness becomes a kind of confusion. He looked down at the tabletop. I kept thinking the worst thing was that he didn't want me around. I sat across from him. "No," I said quietly. "That wasn't the worst thing." We did not talk much after that. I packed the folder into my work tote. Then I made tea neither of us really wanted. Ethan went to his room to finish an assignment, and I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing the same cup twice because my mind had gone somewhere colder and more orderly than anger. I started thinking in steps. Step 1, establish what Daniel had taken or used. Step 2, establish who had seen it, paid because of it, or relied on it. Step 3, make sure every false statement connected back to a document, a date, a device, or a transfer. Silence can be useful when it becomes structure. The next morning was bright and thin with early spring light. The sidewalks were still damp from overnight sprinklers. I drove us downtown in the older of our 2 cars because the ramp in the back stuck less when the weather changed. Ethan sat beside me, scrolling through old messages on his phone. Twice he took screenshots and sent them to me without saying anything. When we parked in the garage below Laura's building, he turned the screen toward me. They were texts from Daniel over the prior 18 months. How much was that specialist chair again? Did insurance deny part of the standing frame? Do you still see that neurologist in Aurora? Can you send me the updated clinic letter? Somebody asked how you were doing. Each message was light in tone, casual, almost fatherly if you did not know him. But taken together, they read like inventory. Laura's office was on the 7th floor. It always smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The receptionist nodded us through without small talk, which I appreciated. Laura was already in the conference room with 2 legal pads open and her reading glasses low on her nose. She stood when we came in, greeted Ethan first, then me, and got right to work. For an hour, we built a timeline. Not feelings, not history, a sequence. The divorce order, support payments, the years of delays, the requests for records, the social lies about Ethan being dead or gravely ill, the recent police visit, the amount attached to the complaint, the names of the officers, the exact wording they had used. Laura wrote quickly and almost never interrupted. Then she asked Ethan, "Did your father ever ask you directly for photos, updates, or school materials?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Mostly when he wanted to sound interested." Laura looked up. "Can you separate interest from request?" Ethan gave the smallest nod. "Yes." What followed was one of the clearest things I have ever heard him do. He identified each message by type. Personal, performative, extractive. Personal was rare. A holiday text. A one-line birthday message sent late. Performative was what Daniel used when he wanted to look involved. "Proud of you, buddy. Heard school's busy. Keep pushing." Extractive was different. It always led somewhere. A request for a PDF. A screenshot. A diagnosis summary. A photograph where the wheelchair showed clearly. Details about pain, treatment, equipment, insurance. Laura put her pen down and looked at me. "Your son," she said, "is very precise." "Yes," I said. "He's had to be." By late morning, she had enough to make 2 calls. One to the Financial Crimes Unit. One to a former classmate of hers who worked with a federal prosecutor's office. She left the room for both. While she was gone, Ethan sat quietly watching traffic through the glass. "I feel stupid," he said after a while. I turned toward him. For what? For answering him at all. "You answered your father." "Yeah," he said. And he wasn't really acting like one. There are some things a mother cannot correct in real time. She can only sit near them while they settle. Laura came back in with a different expression than the one she had left with. More alert. More exact. She closed the door behind her and sat down. "The local complaint is part of something larger," she said. "There are multiple elderly complainants. The 100,000 appears to be only one transaction. The use of Ethan's name may have occurred more than once." I felt the room sharpen. "How many times?" I asked. "I don't know yet." She slid a legal pad toward us. On it she had written 4 headings. Medical records, images, false narratives, financial routing. Then she looked at Ethan. "I need you to think carefully," she said. "Did your father ever mention investors, clients, overseas accounts, short-term opportunities, or people who wanted updates on your condition?" Ethan was quiet for several seconds. Then he frowned slightly, not in confusion but recognition. "When I was 16, he said, he asked if he could bring someone by after one of my therapy sessions. He said it was a friend from work who had a son with mobility issues." Laura leaned forward. "Did he?" "No. He canceled. Said the guy couldn't make it." "Anything else?" Ethan looked at the table, then back up. "He asked once if I still got tired after long appointments. And another time he wanted to know whether my hands shook when I was exhausted. It was weirdly specific." Laura wrote that down. I remembered those days suddenly. Not because of what Daniel asked, but because of what he did not ask. "No, how are you really?" "No, do you need anything?" Only features. Limits. Visible strain. The kind of details a stranger would need if you were constructing a believable story. Laura said she was requesting immediate access to the police referral summary and any attached exhibits. She also wanted to file an emergency motion in family court to preserve records and formally document suspected misuse of Ethan's identity and medical information. Then she looked at me and said, "From this point on, we stop reacting to Daniel and start defining the file." That was the first real shift. Not emotional. Administrative. Not revenge. Process. I asked what she needed from me. She answered in steps. First, I want a master list of every provider who ever treated Ethan and every document Daniel was sent. Second, I want your bank records showing support failures against actual care expenses. Third, I want names of anyone who told you Daniel claimed Ethan was dead, dying, or critically ill. And fourth, I want complete copies of Ethan's text history with him. I nodded and started writing. Then Laura added one more thing. "And do not warn Daniel." That part did not need explaining. If Daniel knew the file was tightening around him, he would move money, edit stories, or destroy whatever still existed on paper or screen. Men like him often mistake activity for escape. By early afternoon, Ethan was tired, so I took him home and came back alone with 2 storage boxes from the hall closet. One held insurance files. The other held old court records and medical invoices. Laura's assistant cleared a side table, and together we began building what she called a clean index. Date, source, type, relevance. Near 4 o'clock, Laura received the first call back from Financial Crimes. She listened without speaking for almost a full minute, wrote something down, and thanked the caller. Then she looked at me. "There's a photograph," she said. I felt my hands go still on the folder I was holding. "Of Ethan?" "Yes." "In what context?" She chose her words carefully. "It appears your former husband used a photo of him in a presentation packet shown to at least one complainant." I stared at her. "What kind of photo?" "We don't have the packet yet. Only a description. Wheelchair visible. Medical hardship narrative. Urgent family need." For a moment, I could not speak. Not because I was shocked anymore. That stage had passed. It was because I was trying very hard not to picture strangers being handed my son's image like supporting evidence for a lie. Laura watched me steadily. "This is why we do it in order," she said. "Not because order is comforting. Because order holds." I nodded once. Then I reached for the next file and kept going until the light outside the conference room glass turned the windows dark. At 6:12 p.m., just as I was zipping the second storage box closed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I recognized immediately. "Daniel." It read, "Need to talk. Call me tonight. Important." I looked at the screen, then set the phone face down. Then I waited. I did not call him that night. I did not answer the message either. Instead, I drove home through light traffic with 2 storage boxes in the back and Laura's notes in my bag. The sky had gone flat and gray by then. Storefront lights were coming on along Colfax, and for a few blocks I found myself noticing ordinary things with unusual clarity. A woman carrying dry cleaning. A teenager balancing a pizza box on one hand. A man standing outside a florist with his coat unbuttoned, looking at his phone. The world has a way of remaining stubbornly normal, even when your own life has turned into paperwork and evidence. When I got home, Ethan was at the dining table with his laptop open. He looked up when I came in. "Did he call?" He texted. "What did you do?" I put the phone face down. He nodded as though that was the correct answer on a test. I reheated soup. He pretended to work on an assignment. Neither of us said much for a while. There is a stage in any serious problem where talking too early just makes it loose again. I had spent all day helping Laura tighten the frame around Daniel's behavior. I did not want conversation to blur it. After dinner, I took out a yellow legal pad and sat at the kitchen table. I wrote 3 headings across the top. What he used, who he told, where the money went, then I made myself stay with process. Under the first heading, I listed every category Daniel had touched or requested: therapy summaries, diagnostic letters, equipment cost estimates, hospital invoices, photos, school achievements, insurance denials, medication summaries. It was longer than I expected. That was the part that unsettled me most. Not a single dramatic act, but accumulation. Piece by piece. Ordinary parental access converted into raw material. Under the second heading, I listed people who might have heard his stories. Friends. Acquaintances. Possible clients. The woman at the pharmacy. The former neighbor who had once sent condolences. The retired man Daniel had insisted on bringing up in conversation months earlier as someone interested in meaningful investments. I wrote until the names became a map. The third heading was harder because money leaves cleaner tracks when the person moving it is careless. Daniel was not careless. He was vain, impatient, and greedy, but not careless. If he had routed funds through accounts or shell entities, he would have tried to make the movement look technical rather than personal. That was where Laura's former classmate came in. At 8:40 the next morning, she called and asked me to come back downtown. Her tone was clipped in the way it got when there was no point preparing someone gradually. When I arrived, there was a second man in the conference room. He stood when I entered, introduced himself as Daniel Rees, and said he worked with a federal task force attached to a broader financial fraud review. He was not theatrical. Mid-50s, plain tie, careful eyes. The kind of person who had learned long ago that people tell more truth when the room stays calm. He thanked me for coming, then opened a slim folder in front of him. We are still in an evidence-gathering phase, he said, but based on what has already been referred to us, your former husband appears to have used your son's medical condition as part of repeated solicitations to older investors. Repeated. The word mattered. Not one lie. A method. He explained it without embellishment. Daniel had presented himself as a father under private financial strain. He described urgent care needs, specialized equipment costs, and time-sensitive treatment windows. He then paired those stories with exclusive, short-horizon investment opportunities that supposedly would benefit both the investor and his family. Some of the targets had been widowed. Some had recently sold property. One had withdrawn funds from a retirement account after being told the opportunity would close in days. I asked how many people. He said, at least 9 that we can currently identify with documentation. Possibly more. Laura, sitting to my left, did not interrupt. I folded my hands in my lap and asked the next question the way I ask difficult things at work, plainly, so no one has to navigate my feelings before they answer. Was Ethan's name used directly? Yes. More than once. Yes. He slid a page across the table. It was not the underlying evidence. Not yet. Just a summary from one interview. But halfway down the page was a line I could not stop reading. The subject described his son's mobility limitations in detail and referenced mounting out-of-pocket treatment obligations. Subject: son. Limitations. Obligations. So clean. So professional. Language has a way of making certain violations sound almost administrative. I asked whether photos had been shown. Reeves nodded. In at least 2 cases, according to witness accounts. Laura looked at him. Do we know the source of those images? Not conclusively yet. I did. Or rather, I knew the category. They would have been pictures Daniel asked for under the pretense of interest. Holiday photos. School event photos. Something sent on a day when Ethan had been tired, or formal, or visibly braced, or seated at an angle that made his condition legible to strangers. I felt a brief, sharp flash of anger then. Not loud. Not hot. Just exact. Reeves continued. The current financial estimate tied to the known complainants had already crossed $600,000. The figures might rise. Bank subpoenas had been requested. A warrant application was in motion for devices and business materials associated with Daniel's consulting work. I looked at Laura. She looked back at me with the same expression she used when reviewing a lab result that confirmed what she had already suspected. Then Reeves said something that shifted the room again. There is evidence, he said, that your former husband may also have represented your son as either deceased or in rapid decline, depending on which version of the story was more persuasive to the audience. I sat completely still. Next to me, Laura said, "We can provide civilian witness statements on that point." "I would like those," he said. I took a breath and said, "He told people my son was dead when it suited him and alive when he needed to sell pity." Reeves met my eyes and gave one small nod. That appears consistent with what we're seeing. By the time the meeting ended, I had a task list. Not emotional goals. Tasks. Get signed witness statements from anyone who had heard Daniel's false narratives. Prepare a clean record of all support arrears. Identify all known providers from whom Daniel had requested documentation. Preserve Ethan's devices and message history. Do not contact Daniel. Do not respond if he escalates. Route everything through counsel. This was the point where fear started turning into order. Not relief. Not even confidence. Just order. That afternoon, I began making calls. Some people were uncomfortable. Some apologetic. Some clearly horrified once they understood why I was asking. A former neighbor said Daniel had told her Ethan was doing worse than expected and needed advanced treatment out of state. An old coworker said Daniel once used the phrase window of intervention over lunch and implied he was liquidating assets for his son's care. Rebecca, the woman from the pharmacy, agreed to sign a statement about the false death claim. Another woman, whom I barely knew, said Jessica had once asked whether anyone had a photo of Ethan from a school event because Daniel wanted to keep something current. That one stayed with me. Something current. As though my son were not a person, but a file that needed updating. By Friday, Laura had assembled enough for what she called a pressure-tested chronology. Every claim Daniel had made now had something beside it. A date, a text, a witness, an invoice, a contradiction, a payment failure, a request for records followed by a suspicious solicitation. We were no longer dealing with impressions. We were dealing with matched entries. Laura spread it across the conference table in neat horizontal bands. Now, she said, tapping the first page, we stop thinking about this as betrayal and start thinking about it as a system. I looked down at the pages. There it was. Daniel asking for cost estimates on equipment he refused to help buy. Daniel requesting updated clinic language. Daniel missing support payments in the same month he was apparently telling investors he needed immediate funds for Ethan's care. Daniel contacting old acquaintances with softened stories about hardship and duty. Daniel, over and over, turning fatherhood into pitch material. Laura handed me a pen. I need one more thing from you, she said. A direct statement. Not about your marriage. Not about his character. About sequence. When he asked. What he got. What he failed to pay. What changed? So I wrote it. I wrote that Daniel abandoned responsibility before he abandoned narrative. I wrote that he sought access without support. I wrote that his interest in Ethan always sharpened when money was near. I wrote that every supposedly concerned request eventually aligned with a financial problem of his own. When I finished, Laura read it once and nodded. This works. Then my phone buzzed. Another message from Daniel. This one read, I know you've been talking to people. You are making this worse than it is. Call me before strangers turn this into something ugly. I showed Laura. She read it, looked at the timeline, then back at me. He's feeling movement, she said. I asked whether I should block him. Not yet. Instead, she had me forward the message to her office account, print it, and log the time. That was the shift. Before, Daniel had been the person creating motion and forcing everyone else to react. Now he was the one sensing structure closing around him. He did not know what we had. He only knew that his version of events was no longer moving uncontested. That evening, I drove home a different way and noticed a dark sedan idling half a block from my house. Maybe it had nothing to do with us. Maybe it did. I parked in the driveway, waited 10 seconds, then went inside without looking back. Ethan was in the living room, the lamp on, his book open again. He looked up and asked, anything new? I set my bag down carefully. Yes, I said. And from now on, we do it by rules. He closed the book on one finger and waited. I sat across from him and told him the plan. Step 1, no direct contact with your father. Step 2, save everything. Step 3, no improvising. Step 4, let the record speak before we do. He listened without interrupting. Then he nodded once and said, okay. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. And this time, before I stood up, my phone lit with Laura's name. I answered Laura before I went to the door. Her voice was low and direct. Do not open it yet, she said. Whoever is there, look first. I moved to the side window near the entry and shifted the curtain just enough to see. It was Daniel. He was standing on the porch with both hands in his coat pockets, shoulders tight, staring at the door as though he could will it open. His car was at the curb, not in the driveway. He had parked a little way off, which told me he did not want to look like he was staying long. It's him, I said. Laura exhaled once, not surprised. Good. Then we keep this simple. You are not alone in the house. No, Ethan's here. Put me on speaker. Set the phone down. Open the door only if you can do it without stepping outside. Do not debate. Do not explain. If he becomes aggressive, call 911 immediately. I said yes. Then I looked at Ethan. He had gone very still in the living room, not frightened exactly, but alert in the way children become when they have learned that adult instability often arrives wearing a familiar face. I set the phone on the entry table with Laura on speaker, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door halfway. Cold air came in first. Then Daniel's cologne. Expensive. Overdone. The kind he used to wear to dinners where he wanted to look effortless. He gave me a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. Helen, he said. Finally. I kept one hand on the edge of the door. This isn't a good time. I texted you twice. I saw them. He glanced over my shoulder, likely trying to see whether Ethan was within view. We need to talk privately. We do not. His expression changed very slightly. The polished version of Daniel was always the thinnest layer. Helen, don't do this on the porch. I said nothing. That is one thing people like Daniel never understand until it is too late. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is placement. It tells the other person exactly where they are standing. He lowered his voice, trying a different tone. You've misunderstood something. There are people asking questions about my work, and your name came up because of old records. That's all. If you keep feeding them personal history, you'll make this look worse than it is. From the phone on the table, Laura said calmly, Mr. Mercer, this is Laura Bennett. I represent Helen Chin. If you have anything to communicate, you may do so through counsel. Daniel froze. He looked past me and saw the phone. Then he looked back at me, and for the first time since I had opened the door, the performance slipped completely. You brought your lawyer into this? I said, you brought the police to my house. His jaw tightened. That was not supposed to happen. The sentence landed between us with a clarity so complete I almost appreciated it. Not denial. Not outrage. A mistake in execution. Behind me, I heard the slight sound of Ethan's chair shifting on the hardwood. Daniel heard it too. His eyes moved past my shoulder again. I need to speak to my son. No, I said. I have rights. You have counsel, Laura said from the phone. Use it. He took one step toward the door. Not enough to enter, but enough to test the boundary. I did not move back. For a few seconds, we stood there with the porch light above us and the cold air moving around the frame. His face had gone flatter now, the social charm fully stripped away. This was the Daniel I knew best, the one who appeared when admiration failed him. Helen, he said quietly, you don't understand what kind of people are involved. I understand enough. This can still be contained. No, I said. It can't. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. So that's it. You've been waiting for a chance to ruin me. There are accusations so predictable they no longer require defense. I said, step off my porch. He stared at me. Then, from the living room, Ethan spoke. Not loudly, just clearly enough to carry. You used my name. Daniel's head turned. Ethan had moved into view without either of us noticing. He was near the edge of the hallway light, hands resting on the wheels, face composed in that steady way he had when he had already thought something through. Daniel's expression shifted again. Softer this time. More injured. A practiced father's face. Ethan, he said, you don't know what they've told you. I know enough. I was trying to fix things. You were trying to borrow pity, Ethan said. You just used me to do it. Daniel blinked once, as if the wording surprised him. He switched tactics immediately. I did what I had to do under pressure. You'll understand that when you're older. Ethan did not answer right away. Then he said, I'm already older than that. The porch went quiet. Even Laura, still on the line, said nothing. Daniel looked at me, and I could see the calculation return. This was not the conversation he came for. He had expected panic, pleading, maybe confusion. Something he could sort through and shape. What he found instead was a closed file, a lawyer on speaker, and a son who no longer needed him to explain reality. He straightened his coat. Fine, he said. If that's how you want it. I said nothing. He pointed once toward the phone on the table. You tell your lawyer this. If federal people are involved, there are things she doesn't understand. There are investors, yes, but there were verbal agreements. Short-term placements. People knew there were risks. Laura answered before I could. Then I'm sure discovery will be very educational. Daniel's mouth tightened. He turned and walked back toward the curb without another word. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there with my hand on the deadbolt for a few seconds after he left. Not because I was frightened, because I was listening. To the engine starting, to the car door shutting, to the tires pulling away. Only when the street went quiet again did I pick up the phone. Laura asked, Are you both all right? Yes. Did Ethan hear everything? Yes. Good, she said. Write it down now. Exact phrases. Especially, that was not supposed to happen, and anything referring to investors or containment. I got a pen. While Ethan went back to the living room, I stood at the entry table and wrote the exchange in full. Time, arrival, wording, tone, sequence. When Daniel took the step toward the threshold, when he acknowledged the police visit as an error in timing, not a misunderstanding, when he framed the matter as containable, when he tried to speak to Ethan directly, when he admitted there were investors. By the time I finished, the conversation had stopped feeling personal again. It was evidence. That was the most important change of all. The next morning, Laura had me in her office by 8. She reviewed my notes, highlighted 3 lines, and sent a copy to Daniel Reeves. Before noon, he called back and asked whether Ethan would be willing to give a formal statement. Ethan said yes. The interview took place in a federal building with too much glass and chairs designed by people who never had to sit in them very long. Reeves conducted it himself. A second woman from the task force was there to log exhibits. Laura sat beside us. I sat slightly back and spoke only when asked. Ethan was steady. He explained his contact with Daniel over the last 2 years. The requests for photos. The oddly specific questions. The casual tone that always led to extraction. He described the way Daniel would disappear for weeks and then return when he wanted information that sounded technical enough to pass as concern. Reeves asked whether Ethan had ever granted permission for his name, photographs, or medical details to be shared for financial purposes. No. Did you know your father was representing your medical condition to third parties? No. Did he ever tell you he was seeking outside support for your care? No. Did he ever provide actual support matching the needs he described? Ethan looked at him levelly and said, "Not even close." The woman taking notes did not react, but her pen slowed for a second. Then Reeves opened a folder. He did not slide it across the table immediately. He looked at Laura first, then at me. "We have a redacted version of one investor packet," he said. "I believe it is better that you see it here than encounter it later without context." Laura nodded once. He turned the first page toward us. At the top was Daniel's consulting logo. Below that was a letter written in restrained, polished language about family urgency, temporary liquidity, and private opportunity. There were numbers, return projections, a short-term placement window, references to offshore holdings, enough jargon to make falsehood look structured. Then, clipped behind it, was a photograph of Ethan. He was 16 in the picture, wearing a navy sweater, seated in his wheelchair outside a therapy clinic. I remembered the day because it had rained afterward, and he had complained, very seriously, that the clinic's waiting room magazines were all for old people. Under the image, Daniel had typed, "My son after another difficult treatment cycle." I do not discuss this publicly, but his care has become more complex than most people realize. For a moment, the room disappeared. Not dramatically, not like grief in films, just narrowed. The edges went thin. I could hear the ventilation system overhead and the rustle of paper as Laura turned one corner of the packet back into alignment. Ethan did not speak. Neither did I. Reeves gave us time. Then he turned to another page. There were line items labeled with medical language distorted just enough to sound credible to laypeople. Adaptive mobility system. Neurological review. Specialized home modifications. Therapy intensification block. None of it matched our actual invoices. Some of it borrowed words from real reports. Some of it was invented entirely. Laura said, very evenly, he reverse-engineered the terminology. "Yes," Reeves said. "That appears to be what he did." Then he opened one more section. A chart. Dates, amounts, investor initials, expected returns. This was not a desperate man making one bad choice. This was repetition. I felt something settle inside me then. Not satisfaction. Not rage. Recognition. Daniel had not improvised this around our son. He had built it. When the interview ended, Reeves told us they were moving quickly. Search warrants had been approved. Financial tracing was expanding. 2 more complainants had been identified. One of them had reportedly invested after being shown additional material involving declining pediatric mobility outcomes, which sounded like Daniel trying to make Ethan younger on paper than he actually was. Outside the building, the afternoon light was sharp and cold. Ethan sat in the car for a minute before I started the engine. Finally, he said, he studied me. I kept my hands on the wheel. Yes, I said. Not like a father. No, we drove home mostly in silence. That evening, Laura called again. The warrants had been executed. Daniel's office storage unit had been searched. Devices had been seized. One of the responding teams had also gone through the condo registered in Jessica's name. They had found printed investor packets, account ledgers, luxury purchase receipts, and something Reeves thought would matter in family court as much as in the criminal case. A spreadsheet, Laura said. What kind? A tracking sheet. Your son's name appears in a column header. I closed my eyes briefly. What does it track? She paused. Which version of the story produced the fastest transfer? The house was completely quiet around me. Ethan was upstairs. The dishwasher had not been started yet. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Laura's voice stayed calm. I'll have more tomorrow, she said. But Helen, at this point, he's no longer just defending himself. He was optimizing the lie. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the water. Then I opened the hall closet, took out a clean binder, and labeled the spine with a black marker. Mercer/timeline/final, and on the counter beside it, my phone lit again with an unknown number. This time, it was Jessica. I let the call go to voicemail. Then I stood in the kitchen and watched the screen go dark again. Jessica had not contacted me once in all the years she had been with Daniel. Not when support payments were late. Not when Ethan's therapy bills piled up. Not when people started repeating those ugly little sympathy stories about Daniel's private suffering. Silence had suited her then. I saw no reason to rush toward her now. Still, by morning, there was a voicemail and 2 text messages waiting. The voicemail was brief. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Helen, I know this is a terrible time, but I need to talk to you. I didn't know everything. Please call me back. It matters. The first text said, I have information your lawyer will want. The second came 11 minutes later. There are files he kept off the main laptop. Hidden storage. If they don't find it, he'll say the worst parts aren't real. I forwarded both to Laura and did nothing else. She called within 20 minutes. Good, she said. No response. I'll handle it. That afternoon, Jessica met with federal investigators through counsel. She did not meet with me, which was exactly how I wanted it. By then I had lost interest in personal explanations. Whether she had known everything, known enough, or merely chosen not to ask had become less important than what could be documented. And documented it was. By early evening, Laura called with the first clear summary. Jessica had confirmed that Daniel kept duplicate files on an encrypted external drive in a locked case at his office storage unit. Investigators had already seized the case, but had not yet accessed the contents. According to Jessica, it held what Daniel called his conversion materials: scripts, revised narratives, investor tracking notes, photos sorted by use, language variations for widows, retirees, divorced women, and religious donors. She also said Daniel kept a spreadsheet scoring which versions of Ethan's story produced faster transfers, larger transfers, or longer phone engagement. I sat down at the kitchen table when Laura said that. The wood felt cool under my forearms. Scoring, I repeated. Yes, not grief, not hardship, not panic. Testing. Laura's voice remained even. This is good for the case. I understood what she meant. The more deliberate he looked, the less room there was for confusion, accident, or desperate improvisation. Still, some forms of usefulness feel ugly when they arrive. 2 days later, Daniel Reeves called to say the encrypted drive had been opened. The evidence was worse, but cleaner. There were folders named by investor type. Script files with phrases like "do not oversell decline too early" and "mention treatment window only after first objection." There were copies of Ethan's real therapy summaries beside edited drafts with more dramatic wording. There were expense tables inflated by round numbers. And there was, exactly as Jessica had described, a spreadsheet tracking response patterns. One column was labeled, Sun Status. Used under it were entries like, stable but worsening specialized chair urgent post-treatment fatigue visible decline visible enhance private grief / cannot discuss publicly. I asked Reeves whether Ethan needed to see any of that. He said no unless we chose to use it in a victim statement later. I said, then no. That part was not avoidance. It was boundary. The criminal case moved quickly after that. Daniel was arrested at his office complex, not at our home, which I preferred. He had enough of our private space already. Assets were frozen. Accounts were traced. 2 vehicles were seized. So were a boat slip payment record, a watch collection appraisal, wire receipts, travel invoices, and enough purchase history to make his claim of financial hardship look ridiculous even before the fraud evidence came in. The support arrears were folded into the broader financial review. Laura handled that side with the same calm precision she used for everything else. She filed updated numbers. She matched each missed payment to actual care costs. She documented uncovered therapy, equipment maintenance, transportation modifications, and post-surgical recovery expenses Daniel had ignored while using Ethan's condition as a sales tool. When the plea discussions began, Daniel tried the predictable version first. Poor judgment. Temporary liquidity problems. Informal investments misunderstood by older clients. Family stress. Fear of losing access to his son. None of it held. The records were too structured. The lies were too repeated. The spreadsheet alone ended most of the softer arguments. He eventually agreed to a plea on major fraud charges, financial theft counts, and misuse of identifying and medical information tied to solicitations. He did not plead because remorse suddenly appeared. He pleaded because the file was finished. The sentencing hearing took place on a Thursday morning under flat light and heavy air conditioning. I wore a navy jacket and low shoes because I knew it would be a long day. Ethan came too. So did Laura. We sat in the second row, not the first. I did not need to be closest to Daniel to understand what he had done. He looked smaller than he used to, not humbled, just reduced by fluorescent light and lack of control. The prosecutor did not dramatize the case. She did not need to. She walked the court through sequence, repetition, false medical hardship representations, targeting of elderly victims, use of a disabled family member's real records, and the discrepancy between claimed distress and actual spending. Numbers did what anger never could. They held still. Then the victim statements began. One retired school principal described investing because she believed she was helping a father cover urgent care for his son. A widower said Daniel's descriptions had reminded him of his late wife's illness and that he had trusted him because the details sounded too specific to be made up. Another woman said she had prayed for Ethan by name after reading one of the packets. That was harder to hear than I expected. Not because strangers had known his name, because they had been decent with it. When it was my turn, I stood, adjusted the page in my hand, and spoke slowly. I said Daniel had not simply failed his son. He had studied him. He had taken the ordinary access that comes with parenthood and converted it into material. He had requested records not to understand care, but to manufacture credibility. He had refused actual support while selling invented urgency. I said the damage was financial, certainly, but also structural. He had turned trust, medical privacy, and dependence into tools. Then I stopped. I had written more, but it no longer seemed necessary. Ethan chose to speak too. He did not look at Daniel. He looked at the judge. He said, I spent years thinking the worst part was that my father saw me as a burden. It turns out the worst part was that he saw me as useful. There was no movement in the room after that. Not for several seconds. The sentence, when it came, was substantial. Prison time. Restitution. Asset liquidation. Priority treatment of the support arrears through the available recovery process. Restrictions on future financial activity. The judge's language was restrained, but one line stayed with me. This was not a lapse. It was a system. Yes, I thought. Exactly. After the hearing, there were forms to sign, follow-up instructions, and a short conversation with the restitution coordinator. Laura handled most of it. I answered what I needed to answer. Ethan was tired by then, so we kept things simple. By the time we got home, it was late afternoon. I hung my jacket in the hall closet. Ethan went upstairs to rest. I stood in the kitchen and, without really deciding to, started unloading the dishwasher. Plates, glasses, the heavy skillet, 2 travel mugs. Order helps when a long strain ends. Not because it erases anything, because it gives your hands something honest to do. At 6, Ethan came back down and sat at the table while I made tea. He watched me set out 2 cups. Then he said, "So that's it." I thought about it. "No," I said. "That's the legal part of it." He nodded. And for the first time in a long while, neither of us felt the need to say more. The legal part ended on paper. The rest of it ended more quietly. Over the next few weeks, I put the house back into a rhythm that belonged to us again. Not a dramatic new life. Just our life, without interruption built into it. I cleared one shelf in the hall closet and moved all the old court binders there. I canceled a few automatic alerts I no longer needed. I updated emergency contacts at Ethan's school and with his therapy office. Laura sent the last summary packet by courier, and after I read it once, I filed it and did not open it again. Some mornings still began early. I would wake before the alarm, come downstairs, and stand in the kitchen while the kettle heated. The house always sounded different at that hour. Vents. Wood settling. One pipe behind the wall that clicked once before going quiet. I used to spend those early minutes planning around Daniel. What he might delay. What he might challenge. What he might ignore until it became urgent for us. That stopped. I began using that time for more ordinary things. Reviewing Ethan's university housing forms. Sorting receipts for the accessibility grant we were applying for. Making a list of small repairs the house needed before summer. The gate latch. The back walkway crack. The kitchen drawer that stuck in damp weather. Peace does not always arrive as relief. Sometimes it arrives as maintenance. Ethan changed too, though not in some sudden, cinematic way. He slept better. He laughed more easily. He stopped checking his phone after dinner. One Saturday afternoon, I found him at the dining table comparing campus maps and adaptive transit routes with the kind of serious concentration he once used for algebra proofs. He had been accepted to a state university not far from home, with a good computer science program and better accessibility support than I expected. When the packet arrived, he set it on the kitchen counter and said, "You open it." I said, "It has your name on it." He said, still, "You open it." So I did. There was a scholarship letter inside. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to matter. We sat at the counter with the paperwork spread between us and the afternoon light moving slowly across the tile, and for a while the future looked like forms and deadlines and course catalogs. That was fine with me. A future made of practical things has a steadiness to it. There were still follow-up calls from the restitution office. A few additional signatures. Some money came through to cover part of the support arrears and a portion of older medical costs. It did not restore the years we had spent stretching every dollar, but it helped. More importantly, it came through rules, not promises. Daniel wrote once from prison through his attorney. I did not read the letter myself. Laura did, then called me and asked whether I wanted a summary. I said yes. Her summary was brief. He claimed he had been under extreme pressure. He said he had lost perspective. He said he never intended to harm Ethan directly. He asked whether there might someday be room for repair. I thanked her and asked whether a response was legally required. She said no. So there was no response. That choice was not anger. It was proportion. Not every apology deserves access. By late spring, the house felt lighter. The folder on the sideboard drawer was gone. The top of the dining table stayed clear more often. Ethan and I fell into a routine of tea after dinner, sometimes with talking, sometimes without. He would tell me about a book, a code project, a professor he had looked up online. I would tell him about a difficult patient, a coworker's retirement plan, the price of peaches, the neighbor's new dog. Small things. Regular things. The kind of things families should be allowed to build around. One evening, After I had finished wiping the counters and he had finished adjusting something on his laptop, he said, "Do you think he ever understood what he actually did?" I dried my hands and thought about it before I answered. "No," I said. "I think he understood consequences. I don't think he understood meaning." Ethan nodded like that made sense. Then he said, "I'm okay with that." And I believed him. A month later, I was in the backyard trimming one of the lavender bushes that had gone uneven near the fence when my phone rang. It was a social worker I knew through the hospital. We had crossed paths on a family support case a few years earlier. She asked whether I had a moment. I said yes. Her voice dropped slightly into that careful tone people use when they are approaching something personal but not asking for pity. She said she was helping a grandmother raising a disabled grandson. The child's father had been using photographs and medical details online to collect money privately. Some of the claims looked false. Some of the money was missing. The grandmother was overwhelmed and unsure where to start. I looked down at the clipped lavender in my hand. Then I said, "Tell her to begin with dates. Then documents. Then names." The social worker was quiet for a second. "You've dealt with something like this." "Yes," I said. "I have." When the call ended, I stayed in the yard a little longer. The grass needed cutting. The air smelled faintly of warm soil and the neighbor's barbecue. Through the back window, I could see Ethan at the table, head bent over his laptop, one elbow beside a half-finished glass of iced tea. That was enough. That is still enough. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. I'm glad you were here. If this reminded you of someone or of something you've lived through quietly, I hope it also reminded you that truth does not need to rush to hold. Sometimes it just needs records, patience, and one person willing to keep the sequence straight. Please like and subscribe if you want more calm, real stories like this one. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always like seeing where everyone is listening from. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I think you may want to stay with one of them.